and welcome to Arguably, where we explore ideas from every angle. Powered by Zera Institute. My name is Maraz Almasi, and before we begin, please subscribe and hit the like button to support our young channel. My today's guest is Khaled Hassan, a national security and geopolitics researcher whose work focuses on Islamism, antisemitism, and media bias in the West. Born in Cairo and now based in the UK, Khaled's intellectual journey is anything but conventional. Raised in an environment where antisemitism was normalized, he later converted to Judaism and became one of the most outspoken critics of Islamist ideology and the Muslim Brotherhood from an insider's perspective. Khaled, thank you for being with us today. When people in Europe hear Islamism, they still picture ISIS. You've warned that the Muslim Brotherhood is far more dangerous precisely because it doesn't look like a terrorist organization at all. What are we failing to see?
Thanks for having me. I think it's actually a very interesting question. What are we failing to see? And I think in many ways, today especially, I think we're failing to see many things. Some of the issues we're failing to see are probably our fault, people like me as well, who, sort of lead the conversation on Islamism. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So obviously, we have focused on the Muslim Brotherhood for, many years now. Myself, and many people before I was even born, in the West, in America and in Europe, have been warning of the Muslim Brotherhood, saying this is a very dangerous organization, this is a very efficient organization, and it completely is. But I think what we also need to focus on is that we're not only fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, because there seems to be a campaign that's growing that tends to, at least in my view now, is also directing the conversation on almost entirely the Muslim Brotherhood, as if we defeat the Muslim Brotherhood, we're going to defeat Islamism in the West. And sadly, I don't think this is the case. I think it's one step in our fight to defeat political Islam, to defeat, Islam that has an agenda, that has a manifesto, Islam that has, a certain political vision or political objectives. And I think this is the challenge we're in now. You're going to see, I think, rightly so, we are focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood and we want to see it designated, but it's much bigger than this. We are dealing with something because the problem is we have in Europe, it's pretty much part of the European DNA now that, we separate the church from the state. The problem is many people in the Muslim community, there is no such separation. And that means that to a large extent, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the West do embrace some, varying versions of political Islam. That's the challenge. And again, this is briefly what I think we're missing. This is what we're not focusing on. And we'll get into more on this, obviously, but I just wanted to say, in the very beginning that I think, I don't want us to go from two extremes. One extreme where we have our politicians not focusing enough on the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other extreme is where they focus completely on the Muslim Brotherhood and ignore the entire landscape. I think we need to have a holistic view, basically.
Yeah, that I entirely agree because we Iranians know the Islamic Republic was, although they were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly Qutb, whose books were translated by Khamenei personally. But we have really a fusion of Shiite extremism and Sunni extremism, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a cross-pollination, and it is really, really dangerous. And I agree with you entirely. I don't think people in the West grasp the extent of this threat. But still, right now, the infiltration is, for the most part, the Brotherhood, I would say. So would you agree that the rest, let's say the IRGC, for instance, they have also infiltrated a lot of institutions, particularly in the UK and in the US, that they are rather tentacles of the Brotherhood? Or would you disagree?
I think, to be honest, the challenge is we are not yet asking the right questions. And by we, I mean decision makers, I mean policy makers. They're actually terrified of asking the right questions. And that means we're having a real challenge with, finding the right answers or the right approaches. So I completely agree with you. The Muslim Brotherhood is, at least institutionally, the main threat. It is, it's the one that has the funding, it's the one that has the media, it's the one that has the companies, it's the one that has, all the money transfers going between different organizations. That is true. But I think to a large extent, the reason I'm also saying this, and the reason I wanted to start with this, is because it's almost impossible to prove that someone is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And as I have said previously in multiple conversations, you don't have like an ID card that says, I'm a member of the Muslim Brotherhood's branch in the UK. It just doesn't exist. So unless someone is openly working for the Muslim Brotherhood or openly working for one of their media organizations, it's going to be almost impossible to prove that this person is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And even if you look at it from a religious, from an organizational perspective and the legal perspective, you're going to see that somebody could say to you, well, yes, maybe I was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood 10 years ago, but I'm no longer a member of the Muslim Brotherhood today. How would you prove this in court? How would you be able to actually take someone to court and decide, well, hold on a moment, yes, you are no longer a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, so even if that organization is sanctioned, you should not be affected. That's why I'm saying we need to focus on fighting political Islam. Because if we focus on fighting political Islam as a whole, we're going to be able to defeat the Muslim Brotherhood, we're going to be able to defeat the IRGC, we're going to be able to defeat others. If we try to narrow down the focus on the Muslim Brotherhood, we're not going to be able to actually achieve much, because again, it's going to be really difficult. And I think this is what our intelligence agencies here in the UK have been saying for a very long time. How are you going to do it? How are you going to sanction them? How are you going to, put them, basically, in front of a judge and say, right, you are, accused of X, Y, Z crimes. So it's really challenging. And that's why I think, we're taking, again, a slightly misguided approach, if you ask me.
I agree. But I think to understand what we are dealing with, the Muslim Brotherhood is a great case study, because they are they are the oldest, they are the source, I would say, and they're quite conspicuous now. Let's ask this question. Do you agree that the Muslim Brotherhood is the most successful political project in modern history? And if so, by what metric? Reach, influence, endurance. I think these parameters are probably very important to understand how to combat political Islam.
Oh yes, I said this a while ago, and I've been saying this for a while now. It's probably one of the most successful organizations in modern history, because if you look at it, this organization has been fought by extremely powerful, governments. This organization has been attacked. This organization has been, its members have been quite literally hunted down, killed, exiled in Egypt, for example, killed, exiled, for decades, banned and outlawed, by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, by others, and it's still very, very, very successful in, at least surviving. It knows how to survive. And that's the main metric for me. This is the fact that they know how to survive after decades of being outlawed by almost every Middle Eastern government. But it's also really challenging because you have to see, I think the challenge is we have in our, landscape, a lot of people who say things for either, political purposes or otherwise. And that's why we're not asking the right questions, because I think a lot of people, have praised, for example, President Trump's announcement that he might designate, branches of the Muslim Brotherhood as terror groups. But I think if we are being really honest about this, if we're being really, practical about this, I think the challenge is we will see that there is a game being played by different actors, and they're extremely, extremely efficient. So you're going to see, for example, that some governments in the Middle East, they fight the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization because it represents a threat to their governments, to the stability of the government. But they don't actually fight the ideas, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's why it becomes virtually impossible for their communities to really defeat the Muslim Brotherhood. So, you're going to find that leaders in many Arab countries, their ideas, their ideology, on Israel, on Jews, on everything else is completely the same as the Muslim Brotherhood. But they don't want the Muslim Brotherhood, to try to challenge their government and, go into politics. And so there is a real challenge. And we need to be honest about this. And we need to be honest and we need to say, to some governments, you are fighting Islamists because you're dictators, because you want to remain in power. But you're not fighting the ideology and the Islamism of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So what would it be if we strip it then of all euphemisms and Western academic jargon? That might probably help to understand the essence of this political Islam, or what we call it.
I think it's actually very, very simple. We need to have a very pragmatic, practical, hands-on approach that says, if you promote certain ideas in the West, you are going to be fought. So if you say we want to bring Sharia law to Germany, we want to bring Sharia law to the UK, you will be banned from joining any political party, or you will be banned from running for office, whether it's in the local government or the national government. If you promote the idea that Israel does not have the right to exist, you will be banned from having, the right to play any role in politics. We need to also make sure that, large concentrations of Muslim communities in the West, where they basically, form a bubble and they start voting for people who are anti-Israel, people who are anti-Semitic, and people who are, that stuff needs to be dismantled. And I said this previously. If you have now, and this was a project that I've worked on, I haven't published it yet, but if you look at certain constituencies in the UK, you're going to see once the percentage of voter, essentially the constituency is over 20% Muslim, you're going to find that the member of parliament is almost always Muslim. They vote for a Muslim guy. They vote for someone who's anti-Israel. They vote for someone who's almost always got a history with anti-Semitism. We need to ban this. We need to say, right, this is not allowed. You cannot do this. We need to dismantle these bubbles. So if we take that approach, we will basically give the Muslim Brotherhood zero chances of survival. But no one is even talking about this. No one is even asking these questions because people don't want, our politicians don't want to recognize the threat.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's also necessary to understand the imperialism narrative behind it, because that's the source of this white guilt that leads to, accepting this type of fundamentalism. So Brotherhood emerged in Egypt under British rule and claims to be an anti-imperialist movement, which is a joke. I'd say it's rather an Arab nationalist movement. How did it instrumentalize anti-imperialism to advance their political faith?
It's fascinating. The history is fascinating. It's because when you look at this, you're going to see that, as you said, they were essentially established as an anti-imperialist movement, that said, listen, Islam هو الحل. Islam is the solution. It's the solution to kicking out the British from Egypt. It's the solution to gaining or winning back the Muslim identity of the countries that were occupied by non-Muslim countries. So you're going to find, for example, that President Sadat was linked to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. President Gamal Abdel Nasser was actually reportedly a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and then they sort of split, or go separate ways. And I think it's because of that. They come with this idea that, we are against imperialism. And for a while, initially, they did fight the British. We have to recognize this. They fought the British with, other forces in Egypt, other movements in Egypt. And that is true. So that's where the anti-imperialism stuff comes from. And to an extent, it is true. This is how they started. But what's the end game here? This is the question. So you and me, we can say, look, we want Egypt to be independent. But I want it to be independent because I want it to be a secular country. I want it to be a secular, free country, democratic country. You want it to be a Sharia law country. So, yes, we both want to kick out the British, but we have very different goals. That's the challenge we have here. And they were very successful doing this. They were very, very, very successful at infiltrating academia in the West, academia in Britain specifically. You have books written by, and I keep talking about this, professors who taught people that I know, members of my family in the UK, and they taught them that, Hamas is a resistance movement, it's an anti-imperialism movement, and they wrote books about that stuff. And for decades, that stuff was published, printed, given out to naive, young socialist students in Britain. So that's how successful they have been. And sadly, to this day, I think Britain is really playing a huge part in mainstreaming Islamism. At least Germany, there are indications of hope, I would say. Britain, there really isn't much being done at all.
Yeah, that's true. But we will talk about that. But first, one question regarding the Brotherhood's success. I would like to know, how is that possible that or how does it differ from other ideological movements when we look at all these liberals, secularists, and academics you mentioned that have been members of the Brotherhood? That's so striking. How does that work in practice?
It's just very pragmatic. The movement is very, very pragmatic, and that's what most people don't understand. I when I went to school in Egypt, I had this guy who went to the same school as me basically, and his dad was a leading figure of the Muslim Brotherhood. We all knew this. This was everyone knew this, and he used to be taken to prison every once in a while. So his dad would be taken to prison for like a couple of years, and then he would be let out, by the Mubarak government. This was before 2011, before the Arab Spring. And this guy, he was, I remember after the Muslim Brotherhood took over, he said to me, we're going to rule Egypt for 1,000 years, either by the sword or by democracy. We're not going anywhere. And I always talk about this guy because he was secular. He used to drink, he had girlfriends. He had, a very successful family. He drove the nicest car. He drove, a very sort of, he led a very westernized life, and he still fundamentally believed, we, the Muslim Brotherhood, we're going to rule Egypt for 1,000 years. So they're extremely pragmatic, extremely practical. They're almost ruthless. If they don't care what you actually do, whether you go to the mosque, they believe that everyone can play a role. If you are, a secular woman who's, who goes out drinking and, whatever, but you can play a role in serving the Brotherhood, you are as valuable as an imam. who preaches in a mosque. It doesn't really matter. And I think this ruthless pragmatism is really what defines them. And this is why they've survived for so long.
Yeah, you've compared them with Freemasonry, I recall, but with political and theological aims. Where does that analogy break down?
So that analogy actually was made by the interviewer who was interviewing me on the Muslim Brotherhood when I said the membership is secret. So he said, "Oh, just like the Freemasons, that there is this, sort of secret aspect of the membership." But actually, there is a huge theory that's mostly in the Muslim world, basically on the Muslim Brotherhood. So the claim, and this is, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, that you're going to find that they basically claim that the, Freemasons established the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's why both organizations have a secret membership. And, that basically the Freemasons did this because the Freemasons are Jews and they want to control the world. So they establish, these secret organizations to, basically infiltrate governments and all that stuff. I don't think there is any, there's no comparison even between Freemasonry and the Muslim Brotherhood because, Egypt before Nasser took over, Egypt had Freemasonry, and it was much more open, it was much more, tolerant. So it's a conspiracy theory that's mostly promoted by anti-Semites, but organizationally it's completely different. Freemasonry, there is no indication, there is no proof that it has this sort of conspiracy or plot to take over the world. But what we see from the Muslim Brotherhood, that it actually does. I think again, this is the analogy, this is where it comes from. But again, it's a challenge that we have when it comes to, the secret membership of the Muslim Brotherhood. And even if you compare, like my interviewer did, if you compare, that side to Freemasonry, Freemasonry is actually public. There is an office for the Freemasons in Britain. There is a leadership. They're active on social media. And they have no role in politics whatsoever. But the Muslim Brotherhood is completely under the ground. You don't know where their funding comes from. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what they do. So yeah, there is a big difference. But again, it's a very popular anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in the Middle East, actually.
And you said that there are 3 global capitals of the Muslim Brotherhood today: Doha, Istanbul, and London. London shocks quite a lot of people. Why shouldn't it?
It's fascinating. Whenever I feel like people are shocked, I almost feel like, have you not been, where have you been these past, 10 years at least? It's obvious. We see the Muslim Brotherhood, operating freely in Turkey. And we know, about, their Islamist rhetoric. We know about, the Islamist side of the government. And it's the same with Qatar. But it's actually worse in the UK, because in the UK, they're much safer. Because we have the rule of law. And the rule of law says that the Muslim Brotherhood is okay. It's not outlawed. It's not whatever. And that means no one can touch you. So even if the Prime Minister wants to, kill every member of the Muslim Brotherhood, they can't do this. But in Doha, in Qatar, they can. If in Qatar they decide tomorrow, what, we've had enough of the Muslim Brotherhood, because it's not a democracy, because there is no rule of law, then the Amir or the president of Turkey, if they decide, look, we're done with the Muslim Brotherhood, you all have to go, they would have to go. But in Britain, because it's a country of institutions, it's actually the safest option for them. And you're going to find that they certainly move between these countries. So you're going to see that, they go from Doha to Turkey and to the UK, to London specifically. And again, that's because, for decades we have been, told by our politicians that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a threat. They don't promote violence. They actually condemn violence, which is really funny. They condemned the Bondi terrorist attack, by the way, which is, again, something that will fascinate a lot of people. But it's all deception. It's all a plan to deceive people into believing, what, we are not a terrorist movement. We're just an Islamist movement. We believe in political Islam.
Yeah, isn't it called taqiyya? Isn't it called taqiyya? This kind of
so taqiyya it's actually a Shia concept. It has an equivalent in Sunni Islam. So, the equivalent is that you are allowed to lie if you're at war. There is an equivalent, so yes, absolutely. They believe that, you are allowed to lie, you're allowed to deceive if it serves the greater good. And that's what, our politicians are not willing to face.
So in your view, did the Brotherhood infiltrate Western institutions, or were they invited by the liberal naivety?
I would probably say they infiltrated, because they have been working very, very hard on this. And I want to make this perfectly clear, to be honest. I think they work well with governments. Although I have been supporting President Trump since day one, I think he presented an opportunity for the Muslim Brotherhood that no one else presented. In the sense that he is, I'm pragmatic, I am transactional, so I'm going to do business. And that's why we now see, it's fascinating, we now see a senior American official in Qatar every other day. It's fascinating. It's Secretary Rubio was in Qatar recently, and before this, the head of the FBI, who was on the payroll of Qatar, he actually worked for the Qatari embassy in the US. He was in Qatar. So I think they successfully infiltrated the US. I would probably not say that Qatar is Muslim Brotherhood, but I would say that Qatar is 100% in agreement with all the values of the Muslim Brotherhood, with all the ideology, with all, the objectives of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a serious challenge. And I think they're very successful. I don't think, to be honest, that I see anyone who's doing a serious job, someone who's, not for political, score pointing and all that stuff, but like actually seriously fighting them. I don't see anyone fighting them in the West, to be honest.
Yeah, and it is, regarding Qatar, I think is very alarming that all these Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations, be it be it ISIS members or Al-Qaeda members, or even Hamas, they are all hosted there. So I don't understand how the U.S. can see a partner in Qatar. Can you understand the reasoning behind it? Even if it were business, it doesn't make sense in a long run.
Look, it's very interesting, because you're going to find the Qataris, like the Qatari foreign minister, saying, look, we hosted Hamas because the US and Israel asked us to do this. And even if that's the case, let's assume that this was the case. If you were asked by the US to host Hamas so that you can negotiate with Hamas and, reach, a ceasefire agreement and all that stuff, fine. I'm going to argue for argument's sake that this is the case. Why did you invest billions into empowering Hamas? Why did you invest billions in Al Jazeera to promote their narrative? There is a huge difference between, offering them, look, you have to be in Doha because we have to, negotiate with you, we have to talk to you. Even if that is the case, you did not have to get Al Jazeera to promote their narrative, to promote their, their media, to promote their ideology. So it's completely nonsense. I think what we're seeing here
Absolutely.
is Qatar is a very powerful country because it has a very small population and it has billions and billions and billions of dollars. And it's the only way it can remain relevant. Qatar it's actually quite funny because President Sadat used to say, some countries that are kiosks, kiosks that opened, in the Gulf, basically. That's how he refers to them, like you're so tiny that you are irrelevant. But because of the money you have, you are gaining prominence. This is the only way you can be, a serious, player regionally and globally. And I think a lot of people, you would talk to politicians in the UK and they'd say, look, Qatar is an ally. Qatar is an ally. And it's like, can you explain to me how and why Qatar is an ally? Can you explain to me how and why Turkey is an ally? So when you say Turkey is an ally, that's mostly the case is they're just scared of seeing Turkey, which is in Europe. Basically, if it's kicked out of NATO, it will join the Russians. And that means it's serious security problems for the West. So it's not really an ally because, we have values that we share. It's just for other reasons, whether it's business or out of fear or whatever it is. And at some point, these alliances, alliances between two quotes, will be tested. At some point, Turkey will choose someone else.
But I think Qatar is nowhere close to what Turkey is, in terms of power. Qatar is tiny. It has no military power.
Yes.
If the Iranian regime falls, it's helpless. And Qatar's values are the opposite of the U.S. values. So how can Qatar be an ally? It's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, the U.S. no longer has values. We need to face this. The U.S. no longer has values. When you have somebody like Tucker Carlson, when you have somebody like Candace Owens, and those people actually have now huge influence over U.S. foreign policy. When you have people like J.D. Vance in office, let's face, I'm not. The beautiful thing about being independent, fully independent, is that I can look everyone in the eye and say, listen, you are full of nonsense. I don't have anything to fear. And that's the beauty of this. So you have to admit that the US today does not really have any values. We used to have democracy, as one of the main values driving US foreign policy. But the US has no issues whatsoever shaking hands with the most horrific dictators who kill their own people. Because you know what? Business is business. So I think it's not Qatar to blame. Qatar is extremely powerful. But equally, we have, influencers who are desperate for any funding. We have politicians who are desperate for any funding. And if Qatar offers this, and they offer it very, very generously, much more than any other country in the Middle East, then you see what you see today. So
yeah, it's true. Your work on BBC Arabic shows systemic bias, so which is unacceptable given the taxpayer money involved. We have a similar situation right now in Germany with public television. What exactly could you actually find?
No, I mean, my work on BBC Arabic, it goes back many years. And I think it's perfectly clear to me, let me put it this way. You have a lot of people who are, Muslim, who are native Arabic speakers, who take over BBC Arabic. And I said this before, they have turned BBC Arabic into something that is basically the British Al Jazeera. That's what I call it. They've turned it into, sort of a platform that feels like it's broadcasting from Beirut, that feels like it's broadcasting from Cairo. It's not broadcasting from London. It has nothing to do with British values. It has nothing to do with British interests. It has nothing to do with British national security. It just serves, native Arabic speakers. So you're going to find it's full of anti-Semitic tropes. It's full of support for terrorism, just like Egyptian TV is, just like the Lebanese TV is, and they host a lot of the people. It's about values. It's about identity. When you believe that Israel is such a horrific country and you want to talk to someone, and you're Egyptian, and you want to talk to someone about the Israeli Hamas war in Gaza, you're going to go to an Egyptian guy in Cairo and say, what do you think about what's happening? And he's going to tell you, oh, Israel is horrific. Israel is committing genocide. the Zionist entity, which is what they use to refer to Israel. That's it. It's almost like BBC Arabic is broadcasting, like I said, from Beirut. It's like broadcasting from Cairo. I see no difference. We have naive people who do not even speak Arabic. How can they understand this? How can they, like when you have the BBC Director General and he does not speak Arabic, he does not know what I'm talking about. When I talk to them about this, they feel like, oh, well, this guy is a Zionist. He's a Zionist Jew. He is just biased. Maybe he's an Islamophobe. That's why he doesn't like BBC Arabic. There is, what can you do? It's a really challenging situation.
Would you say the alliance between Islamists and progressives here in the West, is it progressive left? Is it opportunistic or ideologically coherent?
I'd probably say ideologically linked, because you have now openly on the left, you have people saying, America is awful. You would find, people on the left burning the American flag. You would find people, on the left in the UK saying we should not have the flag of the UK, like actually flying from, our public institutions. So I think they really have a lot of ideological sort of, links, similarities. But I think it's also naivety. A lot of people on the left, they believe that, oh, you know what, I remember actually talking to an American Jew, which was really fascinating when I said that mostly Muslims in the US vote liberal, they vote progressive, they vote Democrat. It's the same with, the UK's Muslim community, they vote for the Labour Party. And then you go like, well, and this American Jew is just like, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Why would they? Because she is a Democrat, and she's saying, why would they vote for the party that wants to, give liberal freedoms to gay people, to trans people, to whatever? And I said, well, look it up. And when you look it up, you really come and see, actually they do, not because they believe, in the values of, personal freedoms and whether you're gay or transsexual or whatever it is, you're a free person, but because they have other ideological similarities that they think means that this is the best party to serve our aims. It's the closest party to serve our aims. So it's I don't know where this is going to go, but sadly I think it's a serious threat in the UK. Because over the past, especially the past 10 years, you're going to see that the overwhelming majority of civil servants and academics now identify as left-wing. So now it's almost 7 or 8 out of every 10 academics. Same for civil servants in the UK. So it's becoming a serious challenge. There's no balance even. It's now almost exclusively we are left.
That seems to be the result of a very long indoctrination campaign, I'd say. If you look at the work of Yuri Bezmenov,
Yes.
it is in there. The lectures. You're familiar with Yuri Bezmenov, right?
Yes.
The
Yes.
KGB agent.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So he was warning about it, and I think it was adopted. This KGB ideological subversion, as he calls it, was very successfully adopted by the Islamists. You actually investigated and publicly warned about Islamist figures operating legally in Britain long before October 7th. What institutional failures allowed that?
It's you're totally right, and I think it is subversion, and I think it's subversion from people who hate this country, who hate its values. And the problem is, even talking about this now, a lot of people are like, oh, this is nonsense. He's such a conspiracy theorist. He's he's blah blah blah, and they dismiss the conversation entirely. They dismiss it entirely. They don't want to even have a conversation. Many of those people are actually family members, that I have in my family. They'd be like, no, this is nonsense. You're talking nonsense. And it's a serious challenge because I'll tell you what I think is the most serious challenge. When you tell people basically that organized religion is terrible, that organized religion generally is a problem. When you start to sort of hollow out an entire civilization from its values, from its collective national identity, that's when you start to have a problem. And you have this problem today, also on the right, by the way. So you're going to see now that a lot of people, and you see this in Germany, when Germany is now trying to find people to fight in the army, trying to recruit for the army, they're having real challenges.
Yeah.
Because you have to have faith to be able to say, I will put on a uniform and I will take a gun and go fight somewhere and face the serious risk of potentially never coming back home. Why would I do this? You have to have serious faith. And that faith doesn't have to be in God. You don't have to be sort of, a crusader, like, I fight for Jesus. No. But it has to be faith in yourself, in your country, in your values. And we saw this in the Second World War. Britain had faith in its own standing, in its own collective national identity. People no longer have faith in Britain today. And that's what's going to be a serious challenge over the next 10 years. And I'm saying from now, it is already a challenge, but it's going to be far more serious, because what if there is an actual war, there is a serious challenge, and people just don't want to fight for you anymore?
Yeah, that is a massive problem right now here in Europe, particularly with Germany. Do you believe parts of the British state are afraid of confronting Islamism? And if so, afraid of what exactly?
So anyone who's spent any time around Westminster, working with politicians, members of parliament, and the institutions of Britain, as I have, you're going to see that the main driving factor of politicians and everyone else is mostly fear. Because in Britain now, we have established an atmosphere where if you say the wrong thing, if you say one wrong thing, you will be completely deplatformed. And I say this is the most dangerous thing for anyone in public life, because imagine public life is about speaking out. It's about having a voice. When you have a voice and your voice can reach people, you will be able to win votes. You will be able to, be elected into parliament. You will be able to, hold a position in government, whatever, and you have influence. But in Britain, they are very quick to completely silence you. So if you say one thing that they believe is wrong, the BBC will not host you in its media stuff. Others will not host you. Everyone will avoid you, which means you end up almost completely voiceless. And that's the challenge we've had. So the problem is the exactly, but the problem is I think it's a lot more scary than most people even imagine. For that reason, a lot of people are not even asking the questions that need to be asked. They're not saying, right, is it okay to talk about this? No. If you talk about something like, immigration, if you talk about something like, the threat of Islamism, a lot of these issues means you're going to face the consequences. So people choose not to even talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final question, if Western societies continue to misunderstand the threat of Islamism, what do we lose first? Security, freedom, or truth?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, actually. I think we lose the truth. And this is what really I find really, really challenging, because you have to bear in mind that the entire foundation of Western civilization is the ability to talk and debate and ask difficult questions. If we are afraid of asking the difficult questions, then we lose the truth. And once you lose the truth, I think you start losing security, you start losing freedom, you start losing everything else. And sadly, I think this process has been ongoing, to be honest, since Tony Blair, specifically Tony Blair. And he remains, for some reason, a very popular person in certain circles in British decision-making. But I just don't see a way out of this, to be honest, other than, there's going to be a certain period of challenges for Britain. So challenges, people not wanting to fight in our army, people not wanting to contribute, people having doubts, people not being interested in politics, and that's going to create a lot of problems. And then after this phase, maybe we will come out as a better country, or maybe we won't.
Khaled, thank you for this conversation and for cutting through the euphemisms and evasions that dominate this debate. Thank you so much for your work.